So how do we practice mindfulness personally and professionally?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think that there's many ways, again, like I mentioned, to practice mindfulness. First is this formal practice that we are considering, right? Sitting in meditative positions, practicing yoga formally, those type of ways. There's also informal ways that we can practice mindfulness. So one of the ways that I think about this is when we were kids and we would have a tantrum and we were in kindergarten, what did the teacher tell us to do? To go in the corner and to take 10 breaths, right? Well, why didn't we carry that practice into our adult life? And so that's an informal way of practicing is when we have a tantrum, when we're upset, when we find things that might trigger us, just reminding ourselves that we have the breath by and utilizing it. The breath, for example, there's been a lot of studies, a lot of scientific backing to this practice of mindfulness. And when we use the breath deeply, it stimulates the vagal nerve in our bodies, which basically tells our brains that it's time to turn on that parasympathetic system and to calm the body down. So it's not only just a practice to calm your mind from, it being clouded, but it's also a physiological practice to help us get back into those moments. So when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about it both in formal and informal ways. But thinking about this professionally, one of the things that we talk about quite frequently, both at my personal business, but also in the role that I was at ASU as the culture and equity specialist, was mindful leadership. So recognizing, how we as leaders show up in space, understanding that when we show up into a space as a leader, all of the people who are quote unquote following us or who are employees of that space are watching our movements, are watching the way that we show up in that space to tell them how they're supposed to be that day too. So by you coming into the space, being mindful of that, you are unintentionally or, by changing the mindset, intentionally telling your employees, I'm calm, I'm ready to get to work. Something's happened. I look at me for support. And so that's a part of mindful leadership, but also taking moments to pause before responding to an email or a person. If something, gets me a little riled up, let's say an email, I make it a habit to take a day, right? And that's an intentional pause. It's a practice of mindfulness to make sure that when I'm ready to respond, I'm responding from a place of choice instead of reacting from a place of not having a choice. So that's another, way that we can think about this. And then walking away can be a practice of mindfulness, right? Again, we talk about this from, we're not talking about it just from a space of affirmation of positive things, but talking about it from realistic points of views. And from that realistic space, understanding that, tough love is still love. In order for me to make it the best choice in the situation as a leader, I'm going to choose to walk away, give myself and yourself a few minutes. And then when we're ready to come back and have a conversation, we can. So that can also be, a practice of mindfulness, and use of language is important. Dr. Johnson talked about that as well. So there are many ways to practice this professionally.
So does mindfulness look different in different cultures or communities?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's one of the whys behind equitable mindfulness, right? Equitable mindfulness is a cultural, social, and spiritual. And by spiritual, I mean a practice of the spirit, not specific to any religion or spiritual path. But it's because of that understanding that mindfulness looks different in different communities and different spaces, that we've decided to make this more inclusive instead of exclusive, because at the end of the day, we all have different ways of practicing this. It does look different. For example, in Black communities, we practice mindfulness in many ways, from thinking about our grandmothers who used to take the time to cook and like really putting love and intention into stirring that pot, cleaning houses, having that music come on Sunday mornings, Luther Vandross, which would tell us to get out of our beds and that it was time to clean, right? The music, that's a form of mindfulness. Praying, right? In our communities, we do a lot of praying. Praying is a form of mindfulness. Walking, laughing, all of these things can be mindful practices. And we we don't talk about that enough in all of these spaces that have commercialized mindfulness, that people feel like it's very exclusive, that it's one path, one way. And so the point of kind of equitable mindfulness is bringing it back to this point that it can be looked at and practiced differently in different
As I
communities.
listen to you, I'm wondering how can we teach our children about mindfulness?
Yeah, we can teach our children about mindfulness first by modeling it. We have to model mindfulness, and we can't, I call this the seed framework. So the seed framework basically says it's my job to plant a seed, and I can't plant a seed without modeling it first, right? After planting that seed, it's oppressive if you take control of how that seed grows. Now, it's anti-oppressive if you decide to support the person who's using that seed by helping them water, helping them find the sunlight that they need in order for that seed to grow. And so specifically for children who are little individuals that sometimes we don't see them as, it is only our job to plant that seed. It is not our job to make them do anything, because if so, they'll turn away from it. They won't want to use it as a tool. So that's the first thing, modeling. But then using practices that make sense for them, right? When we're talking about demographic specific practices, for example, using our hands as a roller coaster and saying, let's take 5 deep breaths, right? When our fingers get to the top of the thumb, we'll take an in breath, out breath on the bottom, top of the finger, in breath, out breath on the bottom, right? Using the hands or something that's normal to them as a way of doing this. 5 senses, the 5 senses practice. So let's, it looks like you're upset right now. That's totally fine. I hear you. I see you. Let's use the 5 senses. Let's take a moment to see 5 things that we can see, 4 things that we can hear, 3 things that we can feel, 2 things that you can smell, 1 thing that you can taste. And by the time they get to that 1 thing, they've forgotten all about the situation that might have gotten them a little bit riled up and are ready to now have a conversation about it. So number 1, modeling it and remembering that our children are little people. And that's important to the conversation. But then number 2, using demographic specific forms of mindfulness that can work for them. So sitting for 30 minutes is probably not the best practice, but having that as a form of, getting them into it and used to using these practices as their kids is the best way to introduce themselves to it.
So last question for you before I go to everyone and see what their final thoughts are, and then opening up 2 questions would be, as I'm listening to you speak, what also comes to mind is self-care. So where does self-care and mindfulness, where is that line?
Yeah, this is a really, really great question. Self-care has gotten an interesting rep recently because people are using, first of all, self-care and mindfulness should never be monetized. And what I mean by that is when we start to use Western, individualistic, capitalistic systems to define things that are not, we start to create these definitions and ideas about them that aren't necessarily true. So self-care is literally taking care of yourself, right? Mindfulness is literally present moment experience. And so those 2 things are intertwined because they're things that are that should be present in our lifestyles and the ways that we show up for ourselves. Number 1, self-care can be going to therapy, like Therese said, and making sure that we speak these things out loud so that we start healing. Self-care isn't just going to get your nails done, right? It can literally be taking the time to read a book, to pet your cat, to feed yourself comforting food. And all of these things can be done in a mindful way, which again connects the 2. So I think bigger than, creating some sort of regimented way of thinking about self-care and mindfulness, it's understanding that these are lifestyle ways of being and incorporating them into how we show up. Let's think about this, for example. As an athlete, I was a former athlete. We always built in the cool down. We built in rest into, our practices. Well, you have to build in those same things in order for you to be able to show up as the best you when you go to work, when you show up for your kids, your family, period. And so self-care is thinking about building in those pieces of rest as you're coming into showing up as your best self in these personal and professional spaces. So both of those things are linked. And remembering that this is a part of your lifestyle, I think, is the most important.
Well, and